The air in the void hub smelled of synthetic citrus. It was a sharp, chemical scent designed to mask the lingering odor of despair and unwashed bodies, but it only made Archon Kalen's head ache. She adjusted her silk robes, her gaze sweeping over the tiered slave pens. Thousands of biological assets sat in the shadows, broken by neural inhibitors and the weight of the hegemony's indifference. Most were huddled masses of scales or fur, their eyes fixed on the grime-streaked floor. Archon Kalen didn't come here for the masses. She needed a shield, something disposable yet durable, to stand between her and the whispers of the Athelian hegemony's court. The Shadow Stalkers were moving in the dark, and her current security detail was more interested in their pensions than her life. I have walked the hub 1,000 times, but this day felt different, as if the station itself were holding a collective breath. What follows is a warning for those who think a cage is enough to contain a predator. Beneath the observation deck, something shifted. In the center of Pen 42, a single figure stood. It was a Terran, a species usually discarded as too fragile for heavy labor and too stubborn for domestic service. This one was battered, his skin a roadmap of scars and healing bruises, but his spine remained a straight line. While every other captive in the hub remained on their knees, the human stared up at the observation glass. He didn't look like a slave. Thorn felt the heavy neural ring tighten around his throat. It was a thick band of black alloy, pulsing with a low-frequency hum that kept his nervous system on the verge of a seizure. A single magnetic bolt on the underside was loose. Tink, tink, tink. The sound was tiny, lost in the roar of the station's ventilation, but Thorn lived for that rhythm. It was the only thing in this hell that felt like it belonged to him. Or maybe he just wanted to see if an Archon could bleed. The woman behind the glass was draped in gold and arrogance. Thorn watched the way her pupils dilated when they met his. She wasn't looking at a man. She was looking at a weapon she thought she could buy. He let his breath out slowly, keeping his muscles loose despite the ache in his ribs. "The Terran," Kalen said, her voice cutting through the humid air of the bidding floor. "Unit 7 Alpha. I want him." Warlord Vrax let out a low, wet hiss from the neighboring balcony. His scales clattered like dry leaves as he leaned forward, his massive claws gouging the railing. "A Terran, Archon? You bid for a cracked blade. They are soft. Their bones break like dry twigs under the slightest pressure." "He is standing, Vrax," Kalen replied, her tone cold and precise. "While your prize warriors are currently weeping into the dust. I will pay 10,000 credits." Vrax's secondary eyes flickered with annoyance. He knew the Archon's reputation for calculation, but he couldn't see the logic here. He offered 12,000, mostly out of spite. Kalen didn't hesitate. She tripled the bid. The hub went silent. It was an absurd price for a biological whose species was known primarily for being easy to kill. Thorn felt the lurch of the floor as the pen's magnetic locks disengaged. Two hegemony guards, armored in shimmering kinetic plates, stepped toward him. They didn't use the prods. They had seen the way he looked at them. Instead, they kept their rifles leveled at his chest until the neural ring flared, a white-hot spike of agony that forced Thorn to one knee. Pain. It was a familiar companion. On Terra, the air was heavy and the gravity was a constant, crushing hand. His ancestors had survived volcanic winters and apex predators that hunted by heartbeat alone. This hegemony pain was artificial. It was a signal, a digital lie meant to simulate the end of the world. Thorn ignored the lie. He focused on the tink-tink-tink of the loose bolt. By the time they reached the Obsidian Star, the Archon's personal flagship, Thorn's abdominal wound had begun to seep through his tunic. He didn't report it. To show weakness was to invite a reset of the neural ring. He followed Kalen through the corridors of polished obsidian and glowing holographic interfaces, his eyes recording every vent, every security camera, and every blind spot. Kinetic dampeners hummed in the walls, making the ship feel eerily still. Kalen led him to a small, sterile cabin near her private quarters. She turned, her gaze lingering on the bloodstain on his side. "You will be healed," she said, her voice echoing in the compact space. "Then you will be armed. You are no longer a slave of the hub, Terran. You are the shadow of an Archon." Thorn didn't blink. He watched the way her throat moved when she spoke. She thought she had purchased his loyalty with a few credits and a clean room. "I have a name," he said. His voice was a rasp and used for weeks. Kaylin paused, her hand hovering over the door's biometric lock. "Names are for citizens. You are a legacy of the hub until you earn something better." She stepped out, the door hissing shut and locking with a heavy thud. Thorn stood in the center of the dark cabin. He didn't look at the bed or the medical kit. He looked at the ventilation shaft above the door. A faint, metallic scraping sound vibrated through the hall. It wasn't the engine. It was rhythmic, deliberate, which meant the shadow stalkers were already in the room. The banquet hall of the Obsidian Star was a cavern of shimmering light and the low hum of atmospheric processors. Warlord Vrax tore into a segment of raw groat flesh, his mandibles clicking with wet satisfaction while blue ichor stained the dark stone of the table. Across the expanse, Archon Kaelin watched him with a stillness that served as its own kind of threat. She didn't touch her wine. Her attention remained on the security feed flickering in the corner of her vision, a grainy display of the guest cabin where her new asset was supposedly resting. In the dark of that cabin, Thorn didn't move. He didn't even breathe. The scraping in the vents had stopped, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight against his eardrums. He knew the stalker was waiting for him to reach for the medical kit on the table, expecting the fragile human to prioritize his leaking side over his life. Thorn's hand hovered inches from the kit, but his fingers weren't searching for bandages. They were locked onto the cold, metallic edge of the medical tray. Because the math didn't add up. "You spent 40,000 credits on a Terran," Vrax rumbled, his secondary eyes tracking the movement of Kaelin's gill slits. "Their home is a high-gravity waste, a place of mud and slow-burning suns that produces nothing but endurance and a stubborn refusal to die. They are built for the long haul, Archon, not the immediate kill. They are fragile." Kaelin leaned back, her fingers tapping a rhythmic pattern against the obsidian armrest. "On Terra, the gravity is twice our standard, Vrax. Their hearts are pumps made of iron and spite. When they perceive a mortal threat, their biological systems flood with a chemical cocktail that shatters their own limiters, allowing them to lift 10 times their own mass or run until their lungs burst. It is not power, Warlord. It is hysterical survival." A shadow detached itself from the cabin ceiling. Thorn moved before the stalker's blade could even clear its scabbard. He wasn't fast like a machine. He was kinetic, a coiled spring of evolution releasing all at once. He caught the stalker's primary wrist, the sound of bones snapping like dry wood echoing in the small room. The assassin was twice his size, genetically enhanced for the kill, but Thorn drove his shoulder into the creature's sternum with the force of a falling moon. He was a ghost. The second infiltrator dropped from the vent behind him. Thorn didn't turn. He swung the medical tray in a wide, vicious arc, the sharp edge catching the stalker across the throat. There was no grace in the movement, only the raw calculation of a Deathworlder who knew exactly how much force was required to end a life. The third assassin hesitated for a fraction of a second, and that was the mistake. Thorn lunged, his fingers finding the gaps in the stalker's armor, his teeth bared in a snarl that was older than the hegemony itself. By the time Kaelin and Vrax reached the cabin, the floor was slick with dark fluid. Thorn stood in the center of the room, his chest heaving, his hand wrapped around the throat of the final assassin. He looked up as the doors hissed open, his eyes wide and bloodshot, reflecting a predatory hunger that made Vrax's scales clatter in an involuntary defensive reflex. "The human has spirit," Vrax spat, though his hand drifted toward the hilt of his own blade. "But let us see how he fares when the stakes are not a dark room and a few shadows. I challenge your pet, Archon. The Imperial Grand Arena. A duel to the death. If he wins, I withdraw my claim to the Obsidian Star. If he loses, you belong to me." Thorn watched the warlord move, a mountain of chitin and spiked scales that shimmered under the artificial suns of the Grand Arena 2 days later, every plate of his organic armor clicking with a sound like grinding stones as he prepared to crush the small, soft creatures standing before him. The human didn't carry a shield. He didn't wear armor. He only held the power blade Kalen had gifted him, the weight of the hegemony's technology feeling alien in his scarred hands. Spite was a fuel. The duel was a blur of dust and fire. Thorn didn't try to match Frax's strength. He moved like smoke, evading the warlord's massive strikes until the armored giant began to wheeze. In the final moment, Thorn didn't use the blade. He used his body. He tackled the warlord, driving him into the sand, his fingers finding the sensitive gap in the scales behind the neck. He didn't stop until the clicking sound ceased. The true test, however, came weeks later during the Hive-Blight boarding action. Thorn stood on the bridge of the enemy flagship, the air thick with the smell of scorched circuitry and the screams of dying drones. He held the mass-yield bomb in his arms like a child. He looked back at Kalen one last time through the comms link. There was no fear in his eyes, only the grim satisfaction of a legacy finally fulfilled. Kalen located the mangled escape pod 3 days later. It was drifting in the heart of a debris field that had once been a fleet. When the technicians pried the hatch open, they found Thorn alive, barely, his body a ruin of radiation burns and shrapnel. On the medical tray back on the obsidian star, the heavy neural ring sat empty. The alloy was scorched, the loose magnetic bolt finally gone, leaving only a circle of dead metal. Kalen looked at it, then at the man sleeping in the recovery tank. She realized then that the chains had never really been around his neck. They had been around the galaxy's throat, and she was the one who had finally let go. The suns of the capital world rose over the palace balcony.